So, good evening, everyone. To give you a little bit of personal background, my name is Sasho Todorov. I'm a DC-based attorney who does a decent amount of studies on military analytics. And so today's talk is called The Tyranny of Binaries. And really what it's going to go into is it's less about war games and more about analyzing the way in which narratives created from history impact war games, and then how war games can potentially build narratives which then impact our view of history. This is not going to be, apologies, let me move over. So there will be at times critiques of how war games present information. A lot of times as we go into this, a lot of these are not really solvable problems. So when I'm discussing certain elements that, for example, war games may not replicate, at times where there's potential solutions, I'll be talking about solutions, but a lot of this is to equip you guys and to kind of spark discussion about how we can potentially, one, keep in mind certain of the narratives that are being built by the war game that may not be at times accurate, and two, also just think about ways down the road to potentially solve these issues. Now, why title things The Tyranny of Binaries? In large part, this is because, in my view, a lot of the way that because war games have to be functional, a war game has to be teachable to two people within a reasonable amount of time. It has to be manageable by two or more people. It has to be playable, ideally within an evening, though we've all had our Twilight Imperium sessions here. And so there will obviously be compromises that are built into that. It's just at times the compromises may not be obvious. So let's go deeper into what do I mean by the tyranny. A war game requires any kind of discrete element to be in a specific state. A hex is planes or it is forced. A unit is damaged or it is full. A unit is in a location A, which means it's non-location B. That's just the nature of having to create these definitions to render what is, quite frankly, an infinitely complex endeavor into something that's actually kind of manageable. The problem is that these binaries shape how we understand matters. They create constraints, and they also create different, as I mentioned before, different narratives that we may not be fully cognizant of. Which brings us to the core problem. How do we reflect warfare without turning into the campaign for North Africa? For those of you who aren't aware of this meme, Campaign for North Africa was a game released in the 70s, which takes, I believe, 3,000 hours to play through fully. It is a game of excess, a game designed never to be played and more for people to purchase and to brag about in their college dorm rooms about how insane this game is. So once again, how do we solve the problems of the infinite complexity of warfare while not turning into this? And so as part of this, I'm going to break it down to basically kind of 5 discrete chunks, which will cover different aspects of war games and which will, in each case, kind of take a look into certain aspects of things, provide some solutions, and really more kind of, as I said before, equip you guys to kind of be on this watch for, one, things that can be improved, or two, things that you may not be fully aware of, or narratives that might be built in that might be surprising or may not be may not be based on real information. So let's begin with, I think, one of the foundational elements of this, which is the nature of the map itself. Or part one, these hexes are cursed. Now, the title image that I used for the Tyranny of Binaries was deliberate. It was to take, this is from Gary Grigsby's War in the East, but I really wanted to do kind of the merge of how a map merges into each other, how the wargame map defines the space, it defines the battle space and defines the information and shapes how we view the battle space and how it is experienced as compared to what it looks like on the ground. Thus, the blending of here from the Baltics of the satellite imagery with the hex. So, what is the first, and in my view, this is one of the most important aspects of kind of one of the ways in which war games shape how we view warfare in potentially ways that are inaccurate. Terrain is a metro map. Terrain is not an ocean. And this is also applies to the maps we'll see when reading history books. These maps often give the implication that these units, that essentially space is an ocean, that you're kind of, that these units are just kind of swimming through these, because as before, our classic view of the NATO counter, it's this square unit which is moving through space, but that's not really how armies move. And in many ways, this actually shapes our view of how armies work in a very foundational and often very error-prone way. Armies move essentially beyond the shortest of distances. Beyond the shortest of distances, armies move on roads. And this imposes distinct constraints on movement, and it foundationally shapes how warfare works. It's why fighting constantly always ends up occurring in the same basic locales. If you look at the battlegrounds of northeastern France, from the wars of Louis XIV through World War I through World War II, fighting is constantly returning to a series of limited road hubs, most of which are from the old Roman road network. The classic example being Arras, Bapaume, also Ypres in Belgium, or if you want to extend further, Bastogne in the Ardennes. This is occurring because, once again, space is not an ocean. If there's no road, your unit's not moving. So what are the errors that emerge from this? I think the biggest one is, especially when it comes to the first kind of binary I want to talk about, which is defining a hex as a specific terrain. At the macro level, so obviously a terrain will be experienced in a different way by the soldier on the ground if he's in a forest, or if he's in a hilly region, or if he's in the mountains. But at the macro level, where we're really simulating really things, once we're getting into like the battalion level simulation, at the macro level, terrain is much more interchangeable than it is distinct. Because once again, you experience fighting over plains in a lot of ways the same way you experience fighting over mountainous terrain, which is you're on a road, you hit a village, which is usually where roads intersect. You go onto another road, you hit another village. If you look at the fighting, for example, now obviously extreme terrain can start causing some distinct changes here, but for the most part, it's when we're actually looking at the question of should a piece of terrain give the defender a specific advantage, at the macro level, they're often very interchangeable because the experience is very much the same. You only really get that dispersal into these unsettled pockets of territory that tends to emerge when a front line begins to solidify. The classic example is World War I here, where if you look at the opening fighting in 1914, it's very much divisions clashing on roads. They'll extend a bit outwards from a road, as they begin to deploy, but for the most part, sticking relatively close to the road network. Whereas once you start entering, as the lines solidify, as they expand outwards to fill in the gaps, is when you'll start seeing more of the fights that are just in open meadowlands. However, it's important to note that once movement resumes, you start getting back into the and villages. So the classic example here, there's constant talk always, we imagine for example, like the Eastern European War, or World War II, we have the constant imaginations, of just tanks ranging across the grassy plains of the steppes, which happened. But for the most part, if you look at the accounts from both the Soviet and German side of what fighting looked like, for the most part, it was advanced parties fighting down a road, taking a village, fighting down another road, taking another village. It's just the nature of how units move. Because even if an infantry unit, theoretically, you can take them off-road for a long period of time. They'll go slowly, but they can go. You can take tracked vehicles off-road for a decent amount of time. But at the end of the day, if you want to sustain them, the horse carts that are feeding the infantry, they can't go off-road. The trucks, it can to a degree go off-road, but it's really not sustainable. And so once again, you have to return to these constraints of the metro map. What is the biggest, and this is where, if there is one area where I will just flat out say this is not so much like a unsolvable problem, just a flat out error. I think the biggest error that this imposes on war games, and not just war games, but also in a lot of ways, a lot of military doctrine, is in how we view terrain, is in how we view the assumptions of how terrain will benefit one party or another. In many war games, the assumption is, if you look at force multipliers, going back to the classic Avalon Hill games, the classic assumption is the more built up the terrain, the more it'll benefit the defender. And that's not actually true. Our classic image is that the perfect ground for attacking is a flat plain. But that's not the case. If you look at what is the best defensive terrain imaginable, the best defensive terrain imaginable is something like Los or the regions around the Somme. It is a flat ground with a slight incline, because you don't need much to create a dominating sight line. And that flat ground allows you to really dominate a surrounding zone with your fires. A defender wants unbroken sight lines. And also, as a quick note here for the chat, please ask questions. Please ask questions during the talk, because also, as we go deeper, I'll have several spreadsheets I'd like to pull up. And so if you have tangents you want to go on, if you have questions, please ask during the talk. So here's some classic, and that means from a classic historical example here, this isn't new. If you read through Clausewitz, for example, this is exactly the reason why Clausewitz instructs people, don't fight in forest. Because if you fight in forest, the broken sideline means you can be infiltrated. You can be infiltrated and you can be destroyed. At a more macro level, less at the direct line of contact, but more in terms of dangers on campaign, this is also why fighting in mountains is very dangerous for a defender. As seen in Alsace, in the Alps in World War I, as seen in the Italian campaign in World War II, as seen in Korea, especially during the Korean War, mountainous terrain, because of the nature in which it, and also as we can see right now in the fighting in Myanmar and Burma, mountainous terrain, by the nature of how hard it is to move around and how defenders end up usually being isolated in these kind of hilltop pockets, renders the defender extremely vulnerable. Even if they are theoretically have an advantage at the opening line of contact, it renders them extremely vulnerable to being infiltrated and being destroyed, because it's very hard to withdraw. And as it continues onwards, I think particularly for modern warfare, the biggest impact here is on really the urban myth of urban combat. The constant, and you'll see this constantly, even in a lot of doctrine, the constant assumption is defenders want to fight in cities. Cities are a value add for the defender. And it's really not the case. The Dupuy Institute had a pioneering study in the early 2000s, which showed that casualty rates, in fact, for the attacker actually suffers lower casualty rates in cities than in comparable fighting around. And I'm currently working with the Dupuy Institute on certain updates to some of their studies, and it pans out. I've assembled databases with the daily losses from Commonwealth divisions in World War II and all Entente divisions in World War I, and as well as Korea and Vietnam. And urban terrain consistently shows a lower loss rate on a per daily basis compared to comparable fighting. You can even see this in Stalingrad. Stalingrad is the myth of urban warfare, the great fortress upon which the Germans are broken, the great equalizer between the outmatched 62nd Combined Arms Army and the 6th Army. In reality, if you look at Stalingrad, and this is something that Glantz noted in his studies of Stalingrad, the Soviets took a substantially worse casualty rate within the city of Stalingrad than they took outside the city of Stalingrad, because urban terrain breaks sight lines. It breaks sight lines and gives a distinct advantage to the party holding the initiative. You can see this today with Mosul. You can see this today with Mosul. You can see this today also, I would note here, with Fallujah, where if you compare the loss ratios between coalition forces and insurgent forces within Fallujah compared to the fighting for Al-Anbar province, the loss ratio was notably better within the city. And this continues, and if you want to look at a particularly impactful example of this at play, Bakhmut. The loss ratio in Bakhmut within the city itself trended towards 1-to-1. And this was against several of the best Ukrainian brigades against a not particularly good Russian manpower quality. The loss ratio was substantially worse within the city than it was outside of the city. And the reason why I'm kind of harping in on this is that this is often cases one of those foundational building blocks of a war game, and yet it's just incorrect. And not only is it incorrect, it has significant real life implications that have continued to be incorrect, even though I think the views on urban warfare are starting to filter out and starting to change away from the idea of the great built up fortresses. Here's a slide. And so when we're looking at a solution, the solution here, in my view, for terrain still imposes distinct constraints on an attacker. The difference is that terrain imposes time constraints. And so, and obviously, as I said before, each time when I go into a potential solution here, the solution will depend upon the scale of the game. If you're doing a micro game, or if you're doing a very zoomed in game for a specific kind of encounter with smaller units, very small time scales, then yeah, it's going to be less important. But as you go upwards, especially as the size of the hex goes upwards, I think there's more opportunities to to start adopting different paths, because you still want terrain. When I say the terrain isn't necessarily a defender force advantage, and that it tends to be more interchangeable, I don't want to say that terrain is meaningless, but rather terrain impacts combats in different ways. A major solution here is through trying to model time consumption. A lot of these solutions, and this is not just because Sebastian invited me to talk here, a lot of these solutions are do what Littoral Commander does. I think the emphasis that a Littoral Commander has on continuing combat, I think, is a very good solution here. And there's also, in regards to success pips, one lesson here that can be taken from video games of the recent, I'm suddenly blanking on the name, but there was a recent war game centered on the First World War. And there, what it required was to take a hex, you'd have to reduce it down from a certain amount of stars or a certain amount of pips. And so those pips, basically the idea of you have to have so many successes before you can force a unit off, allows you to model time consumption. It allows you to see where you can, for example, impose delays on an attacker, even though you're not really shifting the loss ratios. And that also kind of to end, and that'll bleed into when I talk about unit losses, kind of breaking away from a second binary that I'll be talking about, which is success and failure. Okay, what's a corollary to this whole spiel about roads, villages, and hexes? Units are squiggles. If you were to zoom over from a satellite view of watching any army from Julius Caesar all the way to the modern Ukrainian-Russian battlefront, if you look at how units move, units are squiggles. They're not boxes. We have this idea of the box gives us an idea of a unit moving as a coherent mass, as a coherent force that moves together and is available together. What's the problem? That's just not how warfare works. And this can often, in particular, when we look at maps from history books, this has a huge impact on how we view conflict. The classic example here is the American Civil War. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with Gettysburg. What defines the Battle of Gettysburg, especially on day one? It is the slow arrival of these immensely long but very thin columns of men as each side begins to pour troops into a locale. In fact, what defines the Confederate success on day one, because it is a very distinct Confederate success, what defines the Confederate success is that they have 3 roads to feed troops into, to feed troops into battle space into, and the Union only really has 1. And this matters because these units, as I said before, they're long. One of the reasons why, Brett Devereaux has written very well on kind of the constraints of an army's ability to move. One of the reasons why a 30,000 man force is about the largest size you can have for a coherent body moving in one place at one time is because that's basically that's basically the largest force that you can sustain off of a local food supply. But the other problem is that this is going to be a very long column. In the American Civil War, a 30,000 man force is about the point at which, if you try to move a force, the head of the column will be arriving at the next kind of, I'm calling it here a campsite, but basically like the next point in their march order. A 30,000 man force, the head of that column will arrive at the end of their march order before the tail of the column has even left the camp. This imposes distinct constraints. 1, on the ability to feed troops into a battle space, but 2, it also imposes distinct constraints on how fast a unit can move. There's a reason For example, there's a reason why, if you look at many of the most famous historical force marches, those force marches are generally being conducted by smaller armies, because a smaller army can arrive, can kind of do that slinky effect. A smaller army can arrive at its campsite and mass at its campsite much faster than a larger army can. You know, if you move 10,000 men will take about, for the rule of the Civil War, the rule was about 3,500 men, including wagons, per hour. So a 10,000 man force will, if you start setting out from camp, its head the entire force will be on the road within about 3 hours. A 30,000 man force will take about 9 hours. So this is where you start getting to those constraints. And this applies even in modern combat. So the New York Times, I still don't know why they released it just as a background image, but the New York Times released captured march orders from the primary Russian column that did the initial assault on Kyiv. If you look at that column, which was composed of 5th Guards Tank Brigade and 76th Air Assault Division, or VDV Division, the column was 42 kilometers in length. You know, and even if you're accounting for the fact that there was about a 30-minute break in between kind of the spearhead force of 5th Guards Tank Brigade and the remaining body of 76 Air Assault, even with that 30-minute break, that column of 353 vehicles would take about 2 hours to pass any one point on a road. And so you're already occupying 40 kilometers of road space. That imposes distinct constraints on your ability to really push combat power into a battle space, and especially when you have limited roads. What defines the Battle of Kyiv? Even though in theory the northwestern Ukrainian battle space was fairly large, and if it was broken down into hexes, you think, oh yeah, I can easily fit a large force down here. In reality, because you can only move on roads, there was only 2 roads. And critically for the Ukrainians, both of those roads met at one point for a river crossing, allowing for the ability to stop the Russian movement up and constrain their logistics. And so as before, 42 kilometers to deliver 8 battalions of combat troops. So, solutions. Once again, this depends upon the scale of the game, but stacking, I cannot stress how critical stacking is the larger scale of a game you go into. Warfare is defined in large part by your ability, by the constraints imposed by a road network. You saw this in 1914. In 1914, there's constant talk, oh, the Germans should have strengthened the right wing. They should have sent more troops into Belgium. They couldn't. They'd already filled up every single available road in that battle space. Stacking, 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 stacking. It's absolutely critical once you reach a certain level, once you reach a certain scale of gameplay, because that is the foundational constraint. And this is the foundational constraint, and it's particularly true the smaller the time scale goes. You know, let's say if you want to go for a 1 day, let's say, 1 day per turn, if you're going for more of a zoomed in battlefield, the more zoomed in the battlefield, and especially if you're still working with large units, the more stacking has to impose constraints. And also, because of this, metro lines. Friedrich is a classic example of this, and more of kind of the old, you've seen a distinct shift for games that are operating in usually kind of the 18th or 19th century towards kind of this metro line map of the hub and spoke. In reality, I think more games should adopt that, including World War II, especially modern warfare, because modern warfare is really centering on those hubs and the metro line. And let's take a look at this in action. I apologize if this map isn't super readable. It was designed for a grayscale, but I want to point out this battle space here, the northeastern Ukrainian battle space, this is about the size of Connecticut. It's a pretty large battle space. Yet, if you actually look at where the fighting is occurring, if this were a hexen map system, in theory, there's all this open space here. Why didn't the Russians collapse through there? Well, metro map. In reality, what you see is you have the Ukrainian 1st Tank Brigade around Chernihiv, and you have the 58th Motorized Brigade, Ukrainian 58th Motorized Brigade, which had about 2/3 of a battalion here, a battalion here, and a battalion here. And most of the fighting was actually centering right around here, this huge battle space, all this in theory open space, all these Russian units. But in reality, most of the fighting is occurring over 3 or 4 villages right about here at the intersection of the P67 and the E95, because it's a metro map. Because that's where, if you want to cut, because if you wanted to cut the road that goes from Kyiv to Chernihiv, well, you have to do it there. And more importantly, if you want to reopen, and this is one of the critical aspects of why the Russian campaign failed, in theory, you have two tank regiments, you have 2 motorized rifle brigades. Even if all these formations are they're at about 2/3 strength, because at that time they were only deploying professional troops, even though, that's still a substantial concentration of force, but it's a very constrained one because of the metro map. Because what you end up having is the bridge, apologies, where's my cursor? There's my cursor, because you have the bridge near Nova Basan, if people can follow, which is right about where the red double X is. You have this bridge gets blown, and so all these Russian units are constrained onto a single small road near Bobrovitsia. And so the ability to hold even a single village can often have a dominating impact on the campaign, because if there's no other roads, you can't squeeze more units through. Your supplies are constrained. It allows for greater rating, and you're stuck. Stacking. This is why I keep on returning to stacking and the constraints. It's a metro map, and you can't push more units through. And this is also, this is what allows, at the end of the day, when we talk about what sealed the victory in northeastern Ukraine, why you were able to have, for example, around Pryluki, a absolutely heroic performance by basically what was a town militia, why they were able to stop an entire motor rifle division in its tracks. Well, they were on the town. They stopped the tank. They stopped the lead element of the tank division, froze it in place, and because there was no other roads to bypass that town on, well, they're frozen. They're frozen in place. Their supply lines can be raided, and they're just stuck. Okay, so I'm going to take a brief pause right here. Are there any questions?
So I see a lot of conversation. So far, I don't see any very specific questions.
Okay.
But while I let people think about it, are there any other things that you see from Ukraine that you think is applicable? There was a recent Washington Post article about it, about wargaming in Ukraine, that said, I mean, they didn't see, they see challenges of its utility,
Oh,
as
sorry,
NATO's
you keep
conception. Yeah, as NATO's conception of wargaming and what is the reality they're seeing on Ukraine is differing more and more. Do you have any other insights on that?
So this is where Ben Claremont is going to start posting a lot in the chat. Hey Ben, how you doing, man? Thanks for coming out. I think there are some. I think one of the biggest problems is that, and then I'll go into this also when you talk about loss ratios. A lot of NATO wargaming is based on very faulty assumptions. Very, very faulty assumptions of unit functionality and how damage is occurring. In regards for specifically, in regards for talking terrain, in regards to the utility of wargaming, it's weird, and this is when I say that I don't know. When I say that, it's not. I'm not trying to do as a cop out. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of there's several. There's like, I think to me there's one big question that has to be taken away before you can really take away any lessons from Ukraine, which is how different do we believe the impact of air power will be? Because that completely shapes a lot of our assumptions, and that completely shapes a lot of what we believe will and will not apply from the Ukrainian battle space on NATO wargaming. And in regards to that, it also comes down to how fast we believe we can obtain the level of air superiority that we believe we can have. So, for example, I think the classic example here is Krasnohorivka. So the latest, for people, if people have been following the current battle for Avdiivka, the Russians actually, on day one of the operation, which was October 11th, the Russians actually basically do everything right. From a wargaming perspective, if we were to try to simulate it following our normal assumptions, they should have broken through, which is that they had a critical mass of aerial delivered fires via glide bombs. They concentrated a real armored fist of about 4 motorized rifle brigades to punch through on really about a 4-kilometer front. So they did, the constant critique from DoD towards Ukrainian war operations, you just need to Schwerpunkt. The Russians Schwerpunkted. They did two distinct mechanized fists on a very compressed battle space, concentrated artillery, actually obtained strategic levels of surprise, had coordinated fires, had a high concentration of artillery, had a lot of it's hard to define if we call them airstrikes or not, some glide bombs. They did all that, and their operation ate crap and died. Because the Ukrainians were able to have a couple observation drones still flying, and they had still a couple artillery batteries that were unsuppressed, and so the columns were getting plastered by artillery as they were even before they hit their forward line of troops. So the core question is, before we take a lesson from that into our own wargaming, it really depends upon, one, do we believe that our electronic warfare is sufficient to clear the skies of observation drones? And two, do we believe that, one, we can achieve the level of air superiority we expect to have? And two, whether that level of air superiority will be able to have the same impact that we expect it to have? And that's just my personal take, as I remain pretty bearish about that. I do believe that if in a, for example, Desert Storm style scenario where we have a month and a half of uninterdicted aerial campaigns and fires to plaster the enemy, we could have achieved the level of air support that we expect to have. And I know we're rolling out a lot of new electronic warfare systems, but do I believe that we can have that on day one, especially in a conflict with another nuclear power? Not so much. Post-Soviet air defenses is really what both Ukrainians and Russians have proven, is that the Soviet air defenses are actually quite good when in the right hands. And they've also proven that it's very hard to clear the sky with drones. So I know that's a little bit of a weasel. I know that's a little bit of a weasel lawyer answer, but it's those real two foundational assumptions that I don't know the answer to.
No, it's a great answer. The article I referenced also mentioned the role of air power and how its absence is felt in Ukraine, along with the assumption that how they approach wargaming. So great question. I don't see any specific questions, so march on.
All righty then. All right, come on. Let's get more of a hot bench going, to use the lawyer term. Okay. Part 2. Let's think about die. So what's the next binary that we'll go into? For most war games, the assumption is that a unit is off or on. On or off. Or it's on, it's damaged, it's off. Once again, Littoral Commander fixes this with HP, but this is kind of one of the, for your classic kind of hex and counter war game, and for a lot of assumptions, this is one of those basic things that most people will be going into assuming how this works. What's the presumption? The presumption is that a unit loses functionality very quickly. In fact, if we look at kind of where most combat resolution models go towards, most combat resolution most combat resolution models really are baked in the assumption that you're going to cause, the primary impact you do is you cause damage, the second impact you do is you take a piece of terrain. And this is the classic rhetoric. If you've ever read a history book on the Eastern Front of World War II, divisions the size of battalions pops up all the time. No, the assumption is that these divisions are being wiped out. Well, what actually happens? For any of you who are looking to serve, friends, don't let friends join the infantry. The primary striking power of a unit, really since 1870, and it's in arguably, and also this is to go on a brief tangent here, there's some new research being done on the impact of artillery in the Civil War that it may have been undercounted. But definitely since 1870, since the Krupp iron guns sealed alongside several other elements of the Prussian reserve system, sealed the Prussian victory in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, the primary striking power of a unit has been in their fires. However, most of the casualties are taken by the infantry. In World War I, 85, if you look at, and this is just for Americans, if you look at the American Army, in World War I, 84% of combat fatalities occur in either infantry battalions or machine gun companies in infantry battalions. In World War II, 80% of all combat fatalities are infantry branch. In Korea, 75% of battle fatalities hold an infantry MOC or MOS, basically your occupation code. And if you look at even of the rest, most of the gap remaining are logistical troops who are like cooks, clerks, and other units who are serving within infantry regiments, who are still close to the front lines. So that proportion so the infantry regiment proportion of battle fatalities, it's even higher. Even in Vietnam, when you have significant losses from helicopter pilots, which very, very, very significant losses of helicopter crews, even then the battle deaths, about 66.5% hold an infantry MOC or MOS. Basically, the people who are doing the dying aren't the people who are doing the killing. And why does this matter? Because we tend to view a unit they aren't necessarily the same. And also, give me a quick note here. I'm saying that my connection is a little bit unstable, so if I break in and out, definitely give me a heads up.
You just broke out for a quick second there, Sasho.
Okay, so to briefly rewind, a unit's combat power is not one singular item. It's two. It's its ability to contest and hold ground, and its ability to deliver fires, or basically the ability to contest ground, the ability to kill the enemy. And once again, this isn't just because Sebastian invited me to talk. Littoral Commander solves this by having those be two distinct elements, but this is at a wider level. So why does this matter? A unit's ability to contest space depends upon the strength of their frontline battalions. However, a unit will lose its frontline battalions much faster than it will lose its fires. So, for example, a division reduced to a battalion, assuming that division has not been caught in the pocket, most likely that division has retained its full complement and most of its complement of artillery. And so it has retained most of its ability to really deliver damage upon the enemy. What it has lost is its ability to contest and hold ground. So, of course, what's the solution here? Track those two elements differently. The other factor here when it comes to contesting and holding ground is that the assumption of what damage does to a unit can remain functional even at very high losses. This is because of the nature of modern warfare. Modern warfare occurs in an extremely dispersed fashion. So here's a classic example. The highest concentration of fighting power that we will likely ever see in modern warfare occurred in World War I. A division there, for example, on the Somme during the initial offensives, British divisions well into 1917, you'd often see a British division attacking on a 1 mile front. To give you an idea, a British division, the infantry complement's about 12,000 men. That's an incredible concentration of manpower within a front. However, if you actually look at what the firing line, what the actual skirmish line looks like for the infantry, it's far more dispersed because this division's operating 2 up, 1 back, 2 up, 2 back, 2 up, 2 back. So here, for example, here, 2 brigades forward, 1 brigade back, 2 battalions forward, 2 battalions back, 2 companies forward, 2 companies back, 2 platoons forward, 2 platoons back. In reality, when we think about these, when we hear about these hyper-concentrated units, these are actually a massive concentration of fairly thin individual waves. A UK division attacking on a 1 mile front is only putting up about 16 platoons into the actual skirmish line. 16 platoons is about 640 guys. So you've gone from 12,000 men, in theory, to only really about 640, to about 640. Still a lot less than you'd think. And why does this matter? This matters because with only 16 platoons in the actual skirmish line, a defending party can actually match an attacker unit for unit at the skirmish line for a very long period of time unless it is breached. If there is no breach, a German regiment could, at that time, so a much smaller formation, a German regiment could match a UK battalion platoon for platoon and have probably about 2/3 of its forces in reserve for counterattacks, for sealing breaches, and for many other actions. And so even though this unit in theory is much smaller, even though in theory you have this hyper concentration of force, in reality, until there is a distinct success on the ground within the skirmish line of creating breaches, of opening up for those who remember physics, for increasing the coefficient of friction, for increasing the space in which the units are in contact with each other. Until that occurs, a defender can match them unit for unit. What this means is that a unit loses functionality very slowly, even if a unit takes massive casualties. A classic example here, Troisième Division Coloniale on September 25th, 1915. They take 2,300 killed in action. To give you, so basically to put this in context, a single division, about 12,000 men, took about, that'd be about what? A third of our KI of our killed in action from Iraq, maybe like between a half to a third in a single day. Somebody in chat, please correct me if I'm wrong here. So, but even after this disaster, where they lose about a solid 50%, they lose about a solid 50% of their infantry, they still have 6,000 men. They still have a lot of platoons. And so even after this great disaster, for another solid week, 3rd Division Coloniale not only is it's consolidating its conquered ground, it's engaging in active counterattacks, it's expanding in small local actions it's holding, and it's continuing to fight at a very high level. It still has a lot of functionality. On the flip side, you'll see cases, and on the flip side, let's take a look at what happens, what actually causes a unit to lose ground. Because a unit can retain functionality for a long time, in reality, losing ground there, and this is one of the studies that was done in the 80s when starting to look at breakpoints. It's still a fairly understudied element of historical analytics, but looking at breakpoints, which is what is the point at which a unit either A, ceases to attack, or B, retreats. Units will usually retreat because they've gotten flanked. That's, if you look at what actually turns the dial, it's because they've gotten flanked. A unit will cede ground much faster than it will lose combat functionality, depending upon certain circumstances. So, for example, here we have the 3rd Division Coloniale, who lose 2,300 dead, who are still very capable. By contrast, in World War II, during the June 1942 Axis campaign in North Africa, you have a British brigade which is destroyed in its entirety after only about 40 killed in action in a single day. They still had a great deal of its combat functionality remaining, but because it had been flanked, because its road supply line had been cut off, it's rendered completely non-functional. So, and kind of to go down here, when we talk about the losses, this will tend to be more for more serious war games, but to this day, most NATO war games, and a lot of NATO war games, will apply an assumption that 30% losses renders a unit non-functional. You'll see this very often repeated as well in doctrine and in analysis. That all stems from a 1953 study by Dorothy Clark, or Our Lady and Savior Dorothy Clark, who was one of the pioneering American professionals in historical analytics. She did a battalion study, and that 30% losses equals non-functional result. She specifically stated in her study the R squared, or the coefficient, or the coefficient, just how closely that actually matches the results on the ground. She said it was awful, that this was a very, very, very low coefficient of relation, and that a lot more work was needed. Spoiler alerts, DoD never did that additional work, and instead that 30% losses rule kind of became fixed in place. Why? Well, I mean, it feels about right. We tend to assume this kind of narrative of, we believe that a unit is defeated by suffering losses. It's also an easy way to track things. A unit takes damage, it falls back. But once again, that narrative doesn't really hold up. It really comes down to, in reality, it's flanks. It's ceding ground. So, potential solutions. Oh, apologies. Potential solutions. In my view, one, at times, especially depending upon the scale of the game, some of these solutions, there's at times, especially when it comes to the granularity over contesting terrain, that may not be possible. This is where it kind of comes down to the element of continuing combat, as modeled in Littoral Commander, or the PIPs that I suggested, of the idea of, building up points as you steadily grind down a hex, where I think really combat resolution models should focus on objective taking and much less so casualties. Because a unit will, for the most part, it's not going to take for the most part. Now, it definitely does occur, but for the most part, a unit isn't going to get hammered in a single day. A unit's more likely to fall back, to lose ground, to steadily cede a position. A classic example here is Bakhmut. Bakhmut, which lasted for a very long time, which it had in our view, we saw this. Oh, this was a continuous series of Russian failures because they weren't taking the hex. In reality, what was happening was the ground was being steadily ground down and ground down and ground down to the point where the situation actually got extremely dangerous for the Ukrainian defenders. Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee have talked at length about this, but it came very close to a true crisis. And so one option here as well is to, when looking over granularity and kind of shaping combat resolution models around ceding ground, potentially imposing defender penalties for losing these pips. As more and more of a hex is contested, even if the unit isn't ejected, really kind of model, instead of modeling damage, modeling more it being steadily forced out of a space and the increasing danger. For modeling level, if you want to model losses, which you still should, the smaller the scale in the game, the more I think losses will distinctly impact functionality. If you have a platoon level game, for example, at a platoon level game, it is very common for a squad, it's, even though you've had extreme dispersals, at the end of the day, a squad tends to have to remain within pretty close contact with each other. One artillery shell and a platoon just lost its squad. One artillery shell, a particularly nasty bombardment, and you can lose a platoon. So the smaller scale, definitely the more you can model losses. But at a larger scale, losses, in my view at least, should be increasingly modeled more on a macro standpoint. Because it's not the best practices, but a unit can actually be consistently filled back up. A classic example here to kind of fall back, if you look at World War I, for example, the Germans spend the first about 4 months of Verdun with the same divisions in line. They just keep on topping the divisions back up as they rotate regiments out. In World War II, the American Army replacement system was designed around feeding individual replacement into a unit to maintain its functionality at all times. It's been critiqued, but I think there's a reason why German officers were very impressed with it. For a very modern example, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, one of the primary formations fighting for Robotin, fights for Robotin for 3 months, takes casualties in the 4-digit range, and remains fighting. 1, because it's filled back up. 2, because I want to show this. Please tell me if this is appearing on screen. Is the
yes.
Time to wound resolution? All right. So here's the other factor here. Another factor to take into account for losses is that when you're talking about this kind of impact on unit functionality, a lot of losses are going to come back. The U.S. Army took excellent records in Korea, including for the wounded, the day the man was wounded and the day he was processed out, i.e. he was ruled as invalid, died of wounds, or returned to his unit. And what you can see here is that by about day 45, about 50% of all wounded men will have returned to frontline combat duty. And so once again, depending upon the scale of your game, and even in a short time frame, even in a game with a short time frame, you're going to be getting a lot of those men back. So even if we think of the idea, even if a unit takes a heavy hit and takes heavy losses of wounded men, if you have a larger scale game, they're going to filter back. And I think, and this is one of kind of my big positions here where I think a game should really model matters, that should really be modeled. Because the returning wounded men plays a huge role in maintaining unit functionality and more generally, maintaining a force's composition. As a classic example here, about 50% of both French and German replacements from 1916 to 1918 are returning wounded men. And this has a particularly big impact. Now, this is where we start getting into the questions of modern warfare. This has a particularly big impact if you're not losing a lot of prisoners, especially if you're an attacker. If you're an attacker and you're taking ground, you're going to get a lot of men back. Because you're recovering your wounded. For the defender, losing ground can be particularly damaging because you're losing your wounded as prisoners. Now, this is going to be one where we haven't seen major prisoner hauls in the current Russo-Ukrainian war. So there are some major questions about that, but it's just a thing to keep in the back of your mind where even when you're looking at kind of, and this is more from a historical analysis standpoint, even if an attacker may be taking higher losses, their actual permanent losses may be lower than the defender over the long run because of the recovered wounded. But still, that is in large part based upon historical trends when it comes to prisoners of war, historical trends that haven't really held up during the current conflict. So this is kind of a break between part 2 and part 3. So are there any questions?
So there are a couple of questions that I'll assume are for you, which is one, are you yourself a wargamer? Was a question that was asked.
Yes, I definitely am.
Just to follow up on that, beyond a yes or no question, what are some games you enjoyed recently?
So once again, so I'm a lawyer, so I haven't had a chance to play a ton. I have greatly once again, and this is I keep on returning to Littoral Commander. This isn't just because you invited me to talk here. I really do. I think Littoral Commander solves a lot of the problems I've been addressing here. So I've really, really, really been enjoying Littoral Commander. Unfortunately, outside of that, I've been stuck in an arbitration from hell for the past year. So my ability to get together for things for like more serious war games has been greatly limited, unfortunately.
Hey, no worries. I'm not gonna lie, it's this presentation is doing great for my ego. But on that note, I would say the Troll Commander can do a lot of the things that avoid some of this by focusing on the scope. Like it's very small, it focuses on regiment and smaller, because we wanted that granularity. So if you do anything, if you have more than that in a box, right, and it is a lot harder. But I would say like our rules are quite extensive, although it's easy to play, but it only holds about a regiment in the box, right? It's platoon size elements.
Yeah.
So for anyone who's like, oh, big games like you're in Mitchell lands like next 4 series has like his one counter has more units than like my entire box, right?
Yeah.
So the next question says, do units take bad hits because of bad intelligence? What other factors affect like I'm assuming how units roll up beyond being flanked?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in terms of bad hits, it depends upon the scale. A lot of it's shock. If you look at when a unit really collapses, it's from being breached and from shock. So a frontal penetration. This is why you see, for example, classic example in World War One. We don't think of World War One as a big prisoner of war because we don't see these massive pockets. But you look at, for example, on December 15th, 1916, one of the big French counterattacks at Verdun, they take 10,000 prisoners in a day because it's up and down the line. They achieve a critical mass of fires. They rapidly breach the frontal kind of the frontal fortification areas, and these units are just swamped. They're swamped and they're just destroyed in place. Other big hits, not I wouldn't say so much bad intelligence. You can recover from bad intelligence. You can't really recover from being overrun. Other bad hits, encirclements. I think encirclements are the classic example. We haven't, in terms of encirclements, at beyond the micro level, really the only big encirclement we've seen in the Russo-Ukrainian war is the Battle of Mariupol, which was a deliberately accepted encirclement by the Ukrainians to buy time in Zaporizhia. And that produced about 3,000 Ukrainian prisoners. So, that was a deliberate choice. Other bad hits, nowadays with the kill chain, classic example is, well, for both the Russians and the Ukrainians, when you have an incompetent officer who, let's say, forces a unit to all get together behind the lines for a medal ceremony and shows up 2 hours late. Well, those guys get spotted, they get hit, and so you'll see fairly major losses in those occasions. Other than that, in terms of bad hits, and this is where I think things become a little bit more complex when we talk about losses to vehicles versus losses to personnel. You can see very heavy vehicle losses if a column, and once again, this isn't so much bad intelligence, but if a column gets stopped, as we saw around Krasnohorivka, where the Russian columns, because they're still drone observation flying, the column gets stopped and just gets pounded by artillery, which is why you end up with these kind of vehicle. For example, there's this field just west of Krasnohorivka, where it's basically just a BTR-82 graveyard, where there's at least a battalion's worth of BTR-82s that are lost just because the column got stopped. And when the column gets stopped, the crews have to evacuate the vehicles and have to sprint for friendly lines because there's more shells coming.
So the next question asks, is if we model at a more granular level, we have some more assumptions which can make the whole game more sensitive to these assumptions versus more abstracted level models.
Oh, sorry. So if we model
At a more granular level, do we have more assumptions that are in the game that are more sensitive to these assumptions? Or is it versus at the more abstracted level? The question's in the chat. It's the last one.
yeah,
If you need to read
I
it.
see it. I see it. If we have a model and more, so that's the interesting. That's
Basically,
actually
are we
that's a very
making a
good point.
trade-off?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Um, I believe so. I do think because at a more abstracted level model, you can bake in, you can you can add in more tolerances. Because, for example, let's say when a brigade fights a brigade, like if a brigade fights a brigade, you can add in more abstracted models of losing terrain, losing space. You can kind of it can be kind of baked in more versus having to have a hard rule, which is you lose a platoon, which means X. Um, and so yeah, so I do agree. I do agree that the more granular the game, the more assumptions and more problematic assumptions get baked into matters.
I think that's all the questions I see right now. So, but I will say there was an interesting comment of basing off what you were saying about infantry, both being uh the vast majority of casualties and how units slowly lose combat power is that it may seem like there's an assumption that certain skill sets, whether it be engineers or artillery, that are sort of specialized, those are harder to recruit versus filling back infantry units with whether it's soldiers returning from wounds or new fresh reinforcements.
Which is very true. That's the thing where, in particular, you can see this at the more macro level. A classic example is the Soviet army never recovers from the massive losses it takes to its trained artillery professionals in 1941. It fills back up with infantry very quickly. In fact, its infantry gets notably better over time, though I think it peaks in 1943. The artillery, though it's slightly recovers over time, you look at the Soviet artillery arm in 1944, 1945, and it's still fairly primitive, in large part because you lost so many professionals, and it's very hard to replace that. This becomes even more true. You start losing staff officers. That's I think when people talk about what is the most limited resource in building up a force, it's not weaponry. It's not weaponry, it's staff officers. That's the class. It's one of the classic examples why both the Confederate and U.S. armies in the Civil War continue to struggle well into 1865, because just even though they're able to produce a great deal of weaponry, they're able to get the men in the field, they're able to keep the men fed, though with the Confederates, it's a little bit more of a question. They're able to arm them, but at the end of the day, a staff officer takes years to produce, whereas a gun takes a couple of weeks. And if you don't have those staff officers, it greatly limits your ability to engage in command and control. It greatly limits your ability to engage in operations, and also as constantly seen in the Civil War, it limits your ability to, for example, if the commanding officer dies, can you sustain the attack? So yes, that is very true. It's like I know every time. So I've given some elements of this talk I've given in other places. I know every time I my friends don't let friends join the infantry part. I know that always gets a little bit of pushback, but that is unfortunately the truth of the matter is it's a lot easier to fill back up the rifle squads than it is to fill back up just about anything else. And in fact, if you actually look at performance on the ground by the rifle squads, there's and this is going to be very much of a tangent here, but if you actually look at in terms of revealed performance, most of really what you're going to see in terms of your top performers, they're going to reveal themselves not in training, but in actual combat. Frontline combat, you see a very distinct 20%, 80% rule where 20% of people produce 80% of the results, just because of the nature, it's just so much of it just comes down to brain wiring. Which is why you end up with there's the classic citation of Withrow, which is you have about 25% gutful, 50% followers, 25%. He calls them cowards. I don't like the term. But like within any conscript force, your best fighters are going to reveal themselves on the ground, and it's not going to really kind of come from training. It's more going to, though training obviously helps a lot. It's more going to come from whether or not they lucked out in the genetic lottery and they have the right brain wiring to remain functional when combat is occurring. All
I
right.
think you can press
So
on.
Yep. So I've talked about fires a lot, and I think let's go into kind of the next part that I really want to go into here is part three. For those who don't read French, this is not a weapon. I'll explain, and which will make itself very clear very shortly. But to recap, as we talked about previously, a unit's striking power depends upon its fires. Fires have historically, fires have been the primary producer of enemy casualties. Basic rule was about 75% in World War I, about 80% in Korea, about 80% in Ukraine. The reports from both the Russians and Ukrainians are 80% fires, 10% mines, 10% everything else. You know, a unit's fires, that is their ability to destroy enemy positions, to hit enemy units, interdict movement and supplies. All of that depends upon their fires. But what is a unit's actual striking power? The munition is the weapon. And I know this is going to sound kind of counterintuitive to a lot of people, but the munition is the weapon. The artillery piece, the self-propelled howitzer, is just the bandwidth through which the weapon flows. This matters a lot because it is the munition. When you look at scale, when you look at judging a unit's striking power, we tend to think, and this is kind of what I gave it when I gave a talk a couple of years ago on Soviet artillery. The classic trap we fall into is, oh, there's 2,000 artillery pieces, therefore they have to have a ton of striking power. Well, an artillery piece is just in a very, 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 very heavy battering ram, unless they're shells. The shell, the munition, is the actual way in which a unit is deploying firepower, in which a unit actually engages with the enemy. Doubling the available tubes just doubles the available bandwidth for your ability to deploy munitions onto the enemy. And this is important because munitions can scale wildly. You know, for example, let's take to return to Ukraine, which has had very much ups and downs in terms of shell supply. A Ukrainian artillery battery could be limited to 2 shells or 3 shells per gun per day, which is what occurred around Bakhmut. It's what occurred back in June of 2022 during the battle for the Donbass. Or it could have 40 shells per day. And so even though from our perspective, that unit on their order of battle, on their roster of equipment, they have the same number of guns, but they've gone from being able to deploy 3 munitions on the enemy per day to being able to deploy 40. That's a massive scaling in their ability to strike the enemy. That also means that their firepower will be scaling wildly as well. And this really matters because munitions are the primary consumer of resources. When we look at, in terms of mass produced, in terms of mass consumed, let's return to Ukraine. Ukraine has received about 2 to 2.5 million shells. And for these assumptions, then these are very, 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 very back of the napkin calculations. I assigned about 40 tons per self-propelled artillery piece, about 4.5 tons per towed artillery piece, just do some rough calculations. They've received about 15 to 20,000 metric tons worth of artillery pieces, if we just put them all into a scale and weigh them. They've received 90 to 115,000 tons of shells. So about 6 times the mass of shells have been received versus guns. And this really matters when we think about a unit's functionality, its striking power, its actual available firepower. It's not so much the guns, it's what's flowing through the guns. To return to World War I, as I love to do, France on a monthly basis, France was producing 5.5 the mass of 155 millimeter shells as the entire mass of its 155 millimeter artillery park. And this is particularly important in terms of the larger scale of the game. The more time per turn, the more time consumed for the entire game, the more critical managing the supply of munitions is. In fact, I would argue that it is munitions, not units, which is the primary resource that has to be managed. Most games are built around the assumption they shape your ability to fight by the units available at any one time. You lose units, you recover units. New reinforcements come in, usually on a time basis. In reality, I would argue that while that is certainly an impactful element, to me, the primary factor that you have to manage, the primary scaling factor over time, that's limiting a force's ability to really enact its will upon the enemy is actually the munition supply. And this is becoming even more critical in modern warfare. You look at modern warfare, And for a lot of these munition systems, like for example, cruise missiles, the European supply of cruise missiles is in the low 4 digits. You look at what Ukraine was being supplied with, it was being supplied with in the hundreds. That's not that many strikes when you think about it. And increasingly, if you look at also the cost of the munitions, increasingly a weapons platform, especially if you look at, especially when you look at the cruise missile side of things, or if you look at naval combat, increasingly the value of the munitions is worth, if you actually look at procurement costs, the munitions are costing more than the actual launcher that's transporting the munitions. So, what are some potential solutions here? Really, I really want to encourage, especially once again, this always depends upon the scale of the game. I do think that at larger scale games, once you start, let's say if you were modeling the battle for the Donbass, really munitions should be a key resource that you're having to track. In my view, actually probably the key resource. You will burn through your available munitions. A nation will most likely denude itself of its ability to fight on the side of munitions far faster than it will on its ability to put tanks into units or to put manpower into those tanks and IFVs. Munitions to me are the key constraint. In munition availability, really should shape kind of when we talk about the flow of combat, when we think about how you are predicting, how are you envisioning, what I'm willing to commit to any one step, to me, munitions should be the key factor in the back of your mind. And that should scale very heavily when you're looking at unit striking power in particular. Unit, in my view, when you talk about your ability to contest ground versus munitions, to me, contesting ground shouldn't be limited by munitions, but definitely its ability to engage in long-range strikes should be very much based upon that. Its capability should be more a question of how much munitions power you can flow through the unit versus a static amount. To give an example of this, I love returning to World War I for these examples. To give you a classic example here, the entire small arms supply for the French, the 5 offensive, which was about 2 million men, a massive operation lasting about a month and a half, the entire small arms supply, basically your ability to contest ground, was about a train. It was about a train and a half. The shell supply was about 300 trains. So this gives you kind of an idea of just how different the scale is for the ability to, shoot at the enemy, to contest ground, to fire at enemy tanks, versus the ability to load howitzers and hit units at long range. All right, so I think let's take a brief pause. Are there any questions that have emerged?
One quick one, it says, have you designed any games yourself using these concepts or seen, I will add this portion, or seen these concepts in other games?
Littoral Commander. Sorry to keep hovering back to Littoral Commander. It's one, it's the game I've been able to play a lot this year, and two, it does this very well. In terms of building my own games, I have been developing, say before, lawyer, so less time available than I'd like. But I have been developing, yes, and using these systems. And actually, I've been working on it using and I'm nearly got it ready, a system which uses Google Sheets, because Google Sheets can actually refer to other Google Sheets. And so it actually allows for double blind information and a decently greater amount of granularity when tracking information. Because when I talk about these critiques of war games, I'm not saying that war game designers are dumb and bad. What I'm saying is that a lot of these, when you talk about this level of granularity, this can often become very unwieldy. If you're doing a serious multi-day war game where you have flat out staffs, then it gets a lot easier. But when you're doing, especially for a game that you're going to play in an evening, it becomes very hard to track these, which is why you end up with the campaign for North Africa. That being said, I do think that there's a lot of potential for people who are willing to engage in the heresy of breaking analog. I do think there's a lot of potential for using computers just to do the accounting for everything. I do think offers a lot of opportunities to being able to engage in more granularity. Which is why when I've been designing my own wargame systems, I've been built around the assumption that it's going to be operated off of Google Sheets, even though you're playing it in person.
No, it's great. I will say for our professional games that we design at CNA and other places for DoD, like some of our tactical games require mini staffs that are working off Excel sheets and PowerPoints and references that require a lot of like staff work, and it is a huge lift. Um, I say the next question says, so you can talk about how many units of fire the division slash regiment slash brigade slash battalion has the guns in the trains and the throughput from railhead to stores.
That is, yeah. That so I'm not. I don't think that's so much a question so much as Ben.
Yeah.
Thank you for me. So that's a very so Ben. For those of you who don't know, Ben is a great PhD student. And he is specializes on the late Soviet army, and that is very very true. That is one of the things I think the Soviets really got right, which is the Soviets aimed towards thinking about standardizing units of fire, and so the idea of this size of size of an echelon will at a standard rate consume X amount of this, or in that X may be increased by a certain multiplier depending upon specific conditions. But yes, it's a very, very, very useful concept to revolve around. The Soviets in general, I think one of the reasons why I think the Soviets ended up with a very, very mature view of artillery is because they spend World War II, contrary to public assumptions, they spend World War II very much in a fires deficit. And so you see a lot of very intricate, very elaborate, and also very intelligent analyses of really just the nature of the use of artillery, the nature of managing artillery as a reaction to that to make sure that they're never in the same place as they are before. So I think, is that the last? I believe that's the last question. Oh,
One
here,
quick
I think there's
question.
one here.
Yeah. It
Oh,
says one quick question. It says, at the end or as part of your slides, are you going to mention any of the sources shaping your ideas?
so for that, I put these together a little bit fast, but I will. What I'll do is I can send you via email if you want to distribute, or I don't know if the slides will be distributed afterwards, but I can include probably this weekend. I can include a list of everything I've kind of built this off of. One thing that's a little bit challenging is that a decent amount of this is based upon my own research. Which is like, it's not to pat myself on the back, but like, so for example, urban combat, the foundation of my beliefs there was from TDI's urban warfare study, the Dupuy Institute. And that urban warfare study, I can definitely pop links out to that. That is available publicly. And then I've confirmed it with my own research, which has been using genealogical data to create day by day tracking of the killed in action of a division.
To answer the administrative questions, the slides will be uploaded, so you can email me the slides and any add a source slide at the end, and we'll post it to the Georgetown University Google Drive, which you can access through our newsletter.
Mm-hmm. And so I think there's one question here. Here there's a question. I think Adil made an interesting question of, is the reason why munitions need so much resources because of offset strategies, legal consequences, weapon/defense contractors, something else? To answer that in terms of why munitions consume so much mass, is just because you need a lot of them. We forget, but a 155 millimeter shell is about 42 kilograms of explosive and steel, including a fairly complex fuse. And so 42 kilograms, when you're firing a lot of shells, 42 kilograms adds up fast. And so you rapidly hit a point where a gun is consuming more of its weight in shell than it took to actually produce the gun itself. So it really just comes down to munitions are a massive industrial process, just a massive industrial investment. It's one of the reasons why actually that we've really struggled in sustaining Ukraine because of a really anemic munitions procurement during the Great War on Terror. Because of that, just our ability to produce them, because we weren't buying them, a lot of supply chains got shut down, and restarting them to produce that large of a mass of munitions is just incredibly expensive and takes a long period of time. All right, so, okay. I think let's head into part 4. So let's talk about, so for those of you who watched Babylon 5, you'll recognize this, but part 4, be not seeing you. Let's talk about information. Come on. There we go. Here's one of the key problems for warfare. We often talk about the fog of war in terms of disguising where the enemy is. The slight problem is armies often don't know where they are, let alone where the enemy is. Information is a very tangible resource. In fact, if you look at pre-radio, information literally is a physical resource. Information is a piece of, usually it's a piece of paper written down, which has to be physically transported from a command post to another command post, and then poses distinct limitations. Even today, even with electronic battlefield management software, even with radios, it's still extremely hard to know where your own units are. As said before, warfare is this infinitely complex endeavor. So you have a brigade, let's say you have a brigade operating upon a 10-mile front, which can, a 10-mile front, or even let's say a 5-mile front, figuring out where your battalion command posts are, where your battalions are, where your actual lines are, can be extremely difficult. It's one of the reasons why one of the biggest impacts we have seen from drones isn't so much observing the enemy, it's observing your own forces, being able to overfly to check to see, okay, here's where my actual lines are. A classic example here, RUSI and their report from 2022 on the early lessons of the Russo-Ukrainian war, they had this note here, which is in March, 80% of Russian communications are just to figure out where your units are. And this becomes even more complex once fighting starts. One of the key elements of the fog of war is you don't know. A classic example here. There is a listing all the opportunities for breakthrough, which were lost in World War I because the commanding officer didn't know that his division had broken through within a sufficient time to then flow reinforcements behind it. It would take all day. You know, you see this in World War II as well, and you see this continuing on to the Russo-Ukrainian war. You know, units oftentimes, because of the siloization of information, units don't know where they are. Units don't know where friendly units are. Units don't know how successful friendly units have been, and so that greatly limits their ability to actually take advantage of specific situations. The worst manifestation of this is friendly fire. And this has now been publicly reported, but probably the first Leopard, and this has finally hit the public sphere, but probably the first Leopard kill, the first loss of a Ukrainian Leopard in Ukraine was to friendly fire. You know, the initial Ukraine, one of the major reasons why the Ukrainian offensive of the Ukrainian June offensive fails on the Robotina axis is because of a disastrous initial period where you have friendly fire incidences which greatly disrupt operations. Even afterwards, difficulties in the command and control, even with drone overflights, even with battlefield management software, often resulted in problems where a unit, for example, couldn't adjust to take advantage of an opportunity that they might have or an opportunity another unit might have because of inabilities to properly communicate that. To one, know that the other unit had that opportunity, and two, to be able to arrange the process of cooperating to take advantage. This also applies to knowing where the enemy is. Just because a frontline squad knows where the enemy is doesn't mean the brigade knows where the enemy is. And that has, especially the smaller scale the game becomes, this flow of information, especially when you're at levels where, for example, if a squad wants to reach the platoon commander, they may actually have to physically move to tell him that in person, really becomes a distinct constraint on the ability to command. And this has a major impact because this omniscience, in my view, at the macro level, I think one of the biggest ways kind of war games can kind of skew our assumptions is in the metro map, is in how units move. At the smaller level, I think one of the biggest ways war games can kind of shape how we view things and why it's important to kind of check ourselves is because the player has omniscient information. The player knows the status of their own units. The player knows where those units are. The player knows whether those units have succeeded or failed in their operations. The player knows if they cause damage to the enemy. The more sand you can throw into these gears, the better. Because this element of information, this element of the unknown, and I know a lot of professional war games do a very good job of modeling this element of the unknown is critical. It's why, for example, in the war game systems I've been developing, they operate off of the 3 Google sheets. There's the truth, and then there's each player sheet. So there's an element of what I call the coefficient of fiction, which I pulled the term coefficient of fiction from a great book called System Antics, which is directly about this. And the coefficient of fiction is the higher up the chain from where the information originated, the more fiction there is. And so the more you can kind of impose limits on, or even error and false assumptions about a player's view of the information space, the better. And so what are some solutions here? A classic example here is, let's say I believe my unit is of quality X and is at health Y. Maybe you roll a D3. You know, a D3 is like 1 to 2, like, you know, 1 to 2, it's actually a little bit worse than you expected. 3 to 4, it's fine. 5 to 6, it's a little bit better than you expected. Other options here, you know, obviously now this becomes a lot of busy work depending upon the scale of the game. So easier to automate if you're using Excel to track things. But there's a lot of ways, you know, you can do this to also in war games involving irregular forces. Banana Republic by Phil, I believe it was by, I'm forgetting the design studio, but Banana Republic, which is a kind of problematic game nowadays. It was it was made in the early 2000s. There's some problems with it, but Banana Republic did a great job of really modeling all the randomness, chaos, and lack of information you have over irregular forces, where you don't know if that tank crew is going to bolt or if they're going to engage in just a purely heroic action. Other options, the more you can force declarations ahead of time. Now, this once again becomes a lot of busy work, and it can become hard to track. But the more you can force beforehand declarations, the better. Because one of the problems is that when you're acting, the more that you can act and that you can react to a situation not working, the more this can kind of warp your view of how a conflict works. If your assumption is, oh, attack 1 failed, so now I know I have to do attack 2, well, in reality, you wouldn't know that. One game that does a very good job, now this is a computerized war game, but a computerized war game built upon hex and counter principles, the Operational Art of War series does a very good job here with time consumption, where yes, you're doing step by step by step, move by move, but resolving combat can often consume time, and that imposes more limitations on your ability to react to specific results. Another example here, for example, discovery. You know, discovery is a key part of the kill chain. One example here that you can do is, let's say a unit can be discovered for, you know, as part of a ground assault. That doesn't mean they can be hit by long range fires. This would be more at a very low level game. But let's say if you're doing even like a platoon level game, you could have a situation where, let's say an enemy unit, your squad who's engaging them over let's say a block of urban terrain, that squad can fight them. That doesn't mean another squad can call in mortars upon them. You know, and tracking that can be a little bit difficult, but I think there's ways to somewhat smoothly integrate that in a way to add kind of more of that fog of war. Because at the end of the day, and this is when you talk about kind of those tyranny of binaries, the binary is, I think, in my view, the core binary of war games is one brain is controlling thousands and thousands of other brains. You know, let's say if I move a division side, let's say if I'm playing a divisions level game, if I move a division hex to a division counter to another hex in order them to attack a division, that is one human being engaging in what's really an action that's being occurred by 24,000 human beings. And those 24,000 human beings all have their own opinions as to what's occurring. And that's where a lot of the fog of war and a lot of that unpredictability of warfare that defines warfare emerges. So let's briefly, the final section is pretty short. So I'm going to take a look at, are there any questions that emerged? Let's take a look. Any questions? Oh, and to answer the loss, it was Leopard 2. It was Leopard 2. In terms of losses, the first loss of a Challenger, the first Challenger loss was to a 152 millimeter shell, as well as the first Leopard 1 loss. The first Leopard 2 loss, it wasn't a catastrophic loss, but the first Leopard 2 knocked out was from friendly fire. And so now, part 5, we're all in this together. Let's talk about coalition dynamics. What happens when those 24,000 brains all have their own opinion? That is not JFC Fuller, that is Bernard Montgomery, who was a messy Brit who lived for drama. Armies are inherently competitive institutions. So I used to work as a lawyer. I used to work as a lawyer, not within the military, but as a civilian representing officers and enlisted men, often in cases of promotion disputes and matters like this. Armies are competitive institutions. They're pyramids. They're pyramids where each level you climb, there's fewer and fewer slots available. They're hyper-competitive, which means because they're hyper-competitive, they are small p political. There's constant conflict within militaries for prestige, influence, promotion opportunities. Units, a constant element of friction is a unit wants to grab this opportunity, that unit wants to grab that opportunity. Two generals fighting over who's going to be the one who gets to lead this operation. This also involves involvement from civilians. At the end of the day, the civilian politicians, you often see alliances between civilian politicians and military leaders. There's been some excellent reporting of this out of the Ukrainian conflict from both the Russian and the Ukrainian side. And this conflict has a massive impact on warfare. The problem is that this conflict is erased because one of the key binaries of war games is usually you'll have one player or a team of players to a side. They're not playing individuals, they're playing an anthropomorphized kind of invisible spirit. And that erases this element of internal competition. Here's a classic example of this in action, the Second Ain Offensive, also known as the Nivelle Offensive, but the Second Ain Offensive, I believe, is the better term for it. Joffre, the former French commander-in-chief, gets removed as a last gasp by the Briand government to remain in power, civilian influence. The Briand government jumps Nivelle up from army-level command to commander-in-chief because if you look at the officers, when they're looking at their promises of what they want to do, he had just achieved significant victories at Verdun. He claims he has the method to achieve breakthrough. And more importantly, if you look at the other potential options, including, for example, Fayolle and Foch, which has been leading the actually very successful French operations on the Somme, the French government needs a battlefield result that they can show on a newspaper to manage civilian opinion. They need a gain that will show up on a newspaper map. Even though the French operations on the Somme, compared to the British operations, were extremely successful, they were casualty positive in terms of the French lost actually somewhat a decent chunk fewer permanent losses than the Germans. They took distinct amount of terrain. They actually threatened breakthrough multiple times, and oftentimes the problem was the British lines not being able to keep up. Even with all that, even though it was a successful operation, and even though it nearly brought the German army to the brink of collapse, the gains weren't enough to be tangible on the map. And that just wasn't acceptable anymore. After, at that point, close to 800,000 dead. They needed something they could show. Nivelle was the only one who was promising he could do that. That pressure from the civilian world maintained even after the Briand government falls. And so here we have a classic example of military decision-making is being shaped by the internal conflict between French military leaders, where you have army group commanders who are openly sabotaging Nivelle, who are reaching out to civilian politicians, who are setting themselves up to replace Nivelle if he falls, Pétain in particular, and who was engaging in this. And you have Nivelle, who even after Operation Albridge shapes the battlefield in a way that he was not expecting, he's locked in. He can't back down. The civilian government is demanding this result. And the operation's already been launched. He has from a personal career standpoint, and to a degree from a command standpoint, his options are much more limited. This element of internal and external competition is critical to military decision-making. It still exists. I'm using here the example of the actor who played Godfather from Generation Kill. But if you look at one of the reasons why the unit in Generation Kill is being used in the way it was, which was completely contrary to what it should have been, it's because, well, Godfather wants to make sure on his OER, damn it, he is going to have a combat record. He's going to have a combat record. He's going to have unit achievements. And that flows down the chain. You watch through Generation Kill and you see, because all based upon real incidences from the journalist recording, even at a micro level, even within the scale of a battalion, you're seeing this internal competition, this need to have these tangible results because of the way that the military promotion structure works. Opportunities for combat leadership are somewhat low, which means that there's a lot of pressure to grab what you can to enhance your promotion capabilities. Because for people who don't know, if you don't get promoted, your career's over. It's up or out. So how do you model this? Not always required. As said before, even at a battalion level game, you could model this. Let's say if you were trying to model a competition, model even let's say a battalion level game with individual platoons as units, you could still model it, and actually you could be a very interesting game, but I would say it's less important. But the higher scale of the game, especially you start reaching kind of levels where you're really modeling an entire force, I do think this becomes very critical. Now, how do you do it? This is where we get into the campaign for North Africa problem. At the risk of turning this into at the risk of turning every game into an RPG session. Well, I mean, at a purely basic model, one of the simplest ways you can do it is you can impose penalties when different branches have to cooperate with each other. Constant problem. Constant problem. A classic example here, Red Wings. Operation Red Wings, which was turned into a lot of movies and a lot of books by the officer who was in charge of it, who survived for very specific reasons. Operation Red Wings, it was a disastrous SEAL operation in Afghanistan because the SEALs come in, grab an operation from the Marines, they want to do it themselves, they ignore a lot of the briefings, ignore a lot of the planning, and the end result being that a SEAL group is wiped out for very few Taliban casualties. So how do you model these problems? In my view, I think one of the best options, especially once you enter into a team game, especially once you enter into teams, when you have multiple players per side, my favorite model here, and this has been something where a friend of mine who is in the UK, when he was designing a war game for Impal and Kohima in 1944, the Japanese invasion of Eastern India, where he modeled was all are winners, but some win more than others. I.e., in order to win, a team has to win first, and then only one person from that team can actually be a winner. And so there, what you start adding in is that you start modeling that real internal competition, where yes, I need to support, let's say if you're doing Impal and Kohima, where you had a couple division commanders, yes, I need to support that other division, because if he doesn't unblock this valley, then I can't move forward myself, and we can't win. But do I really need to support him that much? I'd rather use my fires to support my own campaign and improve my own chances. This internal competition can become very valuable, especially when you're trying to model a force which is really broken. A classic example here being the Japanese Impal and Kohima, between the rivalry between the Japanese Army and Navy, within the Japanese Army, and a lot of games have done so. But I really would take that to a whole nother level of I really like the singular winner model. Or let's say if both sides are only controlled by one player, one option here is you choose ahead of time secretly, let's say one division commander or one grouping who you want to win more. And that offers some metagame, at that point, there's some metagame elements which come into play where the defender can guess who you're choosing. But once again, it offers an ability to kind of add some internal conflict of, yes, I could do this to win more, but let's say even there, you could have a situation where if that chosen grouping doesn't score enough points or doesn't get enough prestige, let's say you could actually lose despite your side winning, and the other side could win despite losing. One game that did a very good job of this, and apologies, my short-term memory is not what it should be, but there was a game based upon the Russian Civil War released in the early 2000s, and where in fact actually instead of playing sides, the side still existed, but you were actually playing individual military commanders that you drafted from those sides. And so you could actually be in a situation where you're commanding both Bolshevik and white coalition commanders at the same time. So there's been games who have been modeled this, and I think this should be a key part of it, especially if you're in a game where you're operating a multinational alliance. I think this should become critical. Alliance partners can and have lost wars despite winning them. A classic example here being Italy in World War I. Arguably France in World War I with a status with the nature of the post-war coalition, with the nature of the post-war conflict settlement. There's a reason why Foch, the commander who became the chief of staff of the Command Entente forces, there's a reason why this is apocryphally attributed to him, also to General Serrai, who was a French officer in 1914. The quote was where he said that he had lost some of his respect for Napoleon because Napoleon got to fight coalitions, and after commanding a coalition, he realized, oh, there's just so much sand this throws in the gears. There is constant internal struggle that has massive impacts on war planning. Of the British, for example, in World War II, a significant element of the strategy in the Pacific is driven by the need to maintain British colonial prestige. It's also one of the reasons why you see the Italian campaign waged as it was. A lot of the problems you saw with the Balkans and the Greek campaign, where the British are losing massive resources pursuing a win, partly a win by Churchill, but also partly just trying to establish kind of their own internal whims. And this is particularly true and especially if you're trying to do a war game. If you're trying to do a war game, which is a counterinsurgency war game, I would flat out actually add in elements of I would at times flat out have the local parties be their own side, even though there are technically allies with a larger power. I think the actual Cohen games do this very well because very oftentimes the local partner will have distinct and very different priorities than the kind of primary supporter. And in fact, managing proxies, managing the supporter, to me is the biggest factor in whether or not a campaign will succeed or fail. So yeah, that's about it. Kind of once again, as to briefly pull these back, Wargames all the logistics for you. You are going to have to.
Hey, Sasho, as soon as you're just about to go into your conclusions, you froze. So whatever
Okay.
your concluding remarks, however brilliant they were not recorded.
Okay. So here, let me do those again. In terms of general conclusions, war games are valuable educational tools. I did not, the past hour and a half has not been to say that war games are stupid, that they don't contribute anything, that they are broken, that there's all these when I'm highlighting these problems, these are more for one to equip kind of you guys in the audience in terms of, all right, here are some ways which might not be fully reflected in real life. At times, that's due to error. I believe that the replication of terrain in war games is actually flawed. That is where I'm willing to say that there is a flat out error. A lot of times, however, these aren't solvable issues. Unless you have miniature or even major staffs who are replicating everything here, you can't model it. So at that point, I think it becomes valuable to just improve the educational value of a war game, to be able to keep in the back of your mind, this isn't fully realistic, but it's the best available. It's not fully realistic. So keeping in mind when you're shaping your perceptions of a conflict, keeping those lessons in mind. That being said, I said before, I do think there's, and I hope I've laid out a decent amount of options. I do think there are solutions for where there are errors in narrative, where they can be checked and corrected. So yeah, that's the end of my talk. Do we have any questions that have emerged?
So I have one question, which is about SIGINT. It says, does SIGINT focus on how groups work around the world think, or in terms of signals intelligence? Can you expand on that idea a little bit more?
I think was that to Deal
Yeah.
to ask to expand?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And as a side note, kind of reviewing the chat, Ben, that's a good idea in terms of dice rolling the golden, adding an element of randomization for the Golden Boy unit. I very much agree. That's actually a very good option. That's a very, very, very good option here. All rocket strikes. And so question. So while he's expanding upon that, the question in terms of the aggregation of actions mitigate extremes? That is true. The aggregation is interesting. It depends upon, in a lot of ways, actually depends upon the time scale. This is more in terms of like modern war games, yes. In part because modern war games are also modern warfare is more systematized, it's more disaggregated. But you look at, for example, if you go back to about the Civil War and before, Civil War combat, pretty much combat pre-1870, is really more of a game of crowd dynamics more than anything else. And so even small elements of infectious panic can create colossal impacts. Truly colossal impacts. A classic example being the Battle of, you take a look, let's say the Battle of Antietam. The reason why the Confederates line crack at the sunken road, the reason why they crack is because a small a 100-man Alabama regiment, the colonel's trying to adjust because there had been a brief Union penetration. He says, unit about phase. His unit interprets that as unit retreat, creates an immediate chain spiral impact, which collapses the entire line in the space of really only a couple minutes. And so I think it depends. The more modern the warfare, the more modern the game, the more that I do agree that aggregation will mitigate the extremes. And especially if you look at, let's say you're doing an aerial or a naval war game, for both air and naval combat, and this goes back as well, well into the past as well, it's much more system on system. It's one of the reasons why, so kind of an interesting note from the elements of the laws of war, surrender in naval combat, surrender is not effectuated until the captain of a ship surrenders it. So, for example, you could be a gun crew and you could be saying, we surrender, we surrender, we surrender. You can't do that. You can flee from your turret, you can jump into the sea or jump into a boat, but because of how naval combat is very much system on system, it is a ship acting on another ship, almost like almost like a system. You have much less impact of the individual minds within it. Okay. Let's see. Did a deal expand SIGINT? No, not yet. So yeah, so a deal con, if you want the SIGINT question responded, we really do need you to expand on that a little bit. So yeah, so in regards to Nate Rosenblum's question, do you think the changing of forms of these games is required to get a fuller or different picture, e.g., breaking away from hex maps and using map spaces for how far infantry can move? I agree with Sebastian's answer there. It depends upon the era and the focus of the game. So let's say, for example, like if I were to model a battalion, let's say, to return to that map of northeastern Ukraine, if I were to model the actual battle for the Chernihiv and the immediate regions around Chernihiv, you could absolutely do that with hexes. In fact, you should, because units can actually move, because you can actually, units can actually dismount. Units are actually dismounting, moving more into open space. The element of the how formations move, that really goes back, the further the distances involved, the more the metro map imposes dominance. Okay. And so, tactical versus hexes. Okay, yeah. And so I think another factor kind of playing into kind of the conversation that's emerging about the more individual players involved, the more you can kind of model this. It is very true that, one of the biggest limitations on war games is, getting people together to play it on a specific day. And so from a logistical standpoint, beyond just having to manage, the actual tracking within the game, putting a game together is also extremely difficult. And that imposes very real limitations on what you can do. So yeah, that's about it. I'm going to take a look at chat. Did I fail to answer any questions?
I think you hit most of them. So I'll want to take this time as we approach the time to thank you, Sasho. Like, this was a great presentation. Made me think about a lot of things and how I represent things in games and how I do them for work, or also pleasure, or also the games I enjoy, but also some of the compromises. I always say that all games will make some kind of compromise or abstraction, and the real difference between good and bad games, or where you decide to make those compromises and if that works for the game's purpose that you're aiming for. So thank you again for making me learn a lot, and I look forward to having you on the webinar series again. For everyone in the chat, please thank Sasha for donating his Tuesday time for us. I appreciate it.
And thank you very much for inviting me to speak.